Hey folks, it's Cody Stoffer with Playmakers Corner, here to tell you about Code Red coaching. Competing in athletics means you've lifted the weights, you've watched film, and you've got the passion. Problem is, that's what everyone else in the state has done. Perfect your game by honing in on your mental performance with Code Red coaching. Whether you are a team or an individual, Code Red coaching has the tools to create mentally solid habits and set up you or your team for success. Find Code Red Coaching at coderedcoaching.com or call 720-979-1914 to learn more today. That's coderedcoaching.com or 720-979-1914 today. Now back to the show. Hello, everyone. I am your showrunner / host for this episode, Cody Stoffer, and we got our 4A End of the Year awards here. These are awards given to players based off their performance in the regular season, which I always think is an interesting way to go about it. There are a ton of nominees and whatnot to comb through, and we ultimately landed on just 4 finalists for every single award that were then voted on by a committee here. So the way that these work here is we have Coach of the Year, Newcomer of the Year, which is for the best freshman. We have Defensive Playmaker of the Year, Offensive Playmaker of the Year, and Most Valuable Playmaker. So what happened is we found 4 finalists from here at the pod, and then we posted it on Twitter /X for you, the fans, to vote on, which counts as one total vote in our media poll. And then we also have Coach V, Gino, Gideon Phoenix, myself, as well as Coach Woj here, who did not, he retired from being the head coach of Dakota Ridge. And we asked him if he would like to join us on this voting here. And he said yes. So, that was awesome of him to join. And yeah, we're looking forward to a fun set of finalists and a fun breakdown and analysis here of these awards here. So yeah, we all vote and majority wins. But if should there be a tie, you, the fans, are actually the tiebreaker. Not only if you're voting for one side that's tied like 2-2, that side wins. But say 2 other candidates are tied 2-2. Whoever has the higher percentage of votes from said polls is going to be declared the winner. So very important of you to hop on there. There's still time to vote. There is still time to vote on the 5A Playmaker Awards here. So be sure to log into Twitter /X and vote on those. And then near the end of the episode, we will go over our All-Playmaker teams that are just handpicked by us here at the podcast with position limits here. So it's a little bit harder to get in the door, but arguably more prestigious than All-State or anything like that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the 2024 4A Coach of the Year finalists here. So our first nominee that we're going to be talking about here, our first finalist, is Landon McKee of Grand Junction High School here in the regular season. Led this team to a 9-1 record in their first playoff since 2019 and obtained the number 9 seed, courtesy 38 points per game and 14 offensive points per game allowed here. So just some good stuff here, beating Grand Junction Central early in the season 35-14. Beating a metro area team in Denver North, pretty big, 49-0. Beating technically a 5A team here in Fruita Monument, 28-27 in overtime here. Their only loss was to Durango, which was one of the teams that had a bye in 4A. And then won their league here, beating the likes of Centaurus 42-22, Cheyenne Mountain on the road 32-15, Sand Creek 34-6. So those were some of the really notable wins here. And I think that you just got to look at history when you talk about, his performance with Grand Junction. I mean, this team went 2-8 last year, only beating Bear Creek narrowly and Mountain Range. So, to turn that around, regardless of league, regardless of schedule here, it's important. And it's going to be very important for establishing something down the line. And just the year before that, 1-9. So this team has just not been a very good football team over the past couple of years, but Landon McKee helped turn the ship around here, and Grand Junction with a very good season this year, making the postseason and going 9-1. 9-1 is going to be a common record, though, as we talk about our very next nominee here, which is Zach Carlton of Palmer Ridge, going 9-1, scoring 41 points per game and only allowing 14 points per game. Over the course of this season, it included a huge 4 huge wins, scoring over 40 points against Ponderosa, Doherty, Lewis Palmer, and Longmont, before finally losing to Mesa Ridge just by 3 points. Mesa Ridge, another very good playoff team here. But then in their league, beating Air Academy, beating Durango on the road by 3, mollywhopping Vista Ridge, and then beating Rampart as well in their league here. Those are all pretty impressive wins. Plenty of playoff teams in this mix here. And just a year after making state, they lost a ton of talent from last season here. They lost a ton of starters at running back, quarterback, receiver, corner, safety, just everywhere you could think of skill position-wise, but they do such a good job of reloading. And Zach Carlton kept this team focused and on the narrow path here, leading them to 9-1 and the number 4 seed in 4A. Moving along here, we have a new addition to 4A here, formerly in 3A. That is Riverdale Ridge here. Every single time that they climb up, they just continue to do really well. Shout out to Wayne Voorhees, the coach over there. In this first year in 4A, they averaged 40 points per game and only gave up 6 points per game, and they secured the number 14 seed. It started with a win against an out-of-state opponent at home, Freedom High School, that is from Florida here. They beat them 39-0, and they actually went the first 2 weeks without allowing a point. Then they beat Severance on the road 13-8. Severance ended up being a sneaky good 3A playoff team, so I think that has plenty of merit to it. Before going on a pretty strong run here that included, 5 additional wins, and 4 of those wins being shutouts before they narrowly lost to Broomfield on the road 22-13 here, and that was their only loss on the regular season before they beat Grand Junction Central at home. So, first year in 4A, I will say probably a little bit of a down year in their league, but, to go from a 3A playoff team to a 4A playoff team is no easy accomplishment here, but it also shows that if you got the right pieces in place, like Wayne did here, that you can compete with anybody. It's just a region where you live, basically, is what your classification boils down to, and they had the depth, the talent, and the coaching to go toe-to-toe with plenty of these teams here. So that is Wayne Voorhees' resume for Riverdale Ridge. And finally here, we have a first-year head coach here, at least of this program, in Jeremiah Berenson here. 9-1 and the number 1 seed, leading Dakota Ridge here, taking up the helm for Coach Woad, who is joining us here on some of these votes. And, leading this team to a pretty solid season. 37 points per game, 15 points allowed here. Little bit, it started off tough here with the Chatfield loss, 38-23. That's a rivalry game here, so always tough to lose that, but shook it off to go on a pretty impressive stretch here, beating Green Mountain, which is another regional team here, and then beat Mesa Ridge at home 19-14. That is a highlight win right there. They beat Pomona on the road here. Pomona and Green Mountain both being Final Four teams in 3A, so they're no pushover. Beat 5A Cherokee Trail to balance things out here. Beat Ponderosa on the road 36-7. Beat Heritage at home 42-25. That was a big win. Beat Highlands Ranch 47-7, only holding that Highlands Ranch offense to 7 points. Pretty darn impressive. Golden, another playoff team, beat them 47-21, and wrapped up their season beating Bear Creek in a 50-burger and putting up a goose egg. Holding them down to a goose egg is what I should say on the defensive side. Look, these are big shoes to fill. Dakota Ridge is a program of excellence here, and so that's why Jeremiah Berenson, on top of the number 1 seed, gets our nod here for Coach of the Year candidacy. Now, let's go ahead and turn to the votes here, where you, the people, spoke, as well as the rest of our poll here. And let's see where we land. So, according to Coach Woat here, to start off with our outside source here, he is voting for Landon McKee, saying, quote, he has taken a Grand Junction team who had only won 10 games total in the previous 5 years and is 10-1 this year. He's a little bit in the future. League champion and big first-round playoff win. He got his team to total the previous 5 years in wins in just this season, end quote. So Coach Wout here showing some love, not for his protege, but for Landon McKee here out of Grand Junction. Just kidding, Jeremiah and Wout, it's all love here. But yeah, that's Landon McKee getting one vote here from Coach Wout. Moving on to Phoenix, he's going with Wayne Voorhees, saying, quote, "Let's go back down memory lane for a second. Riverdale Ridge opened in 2018 and started off as 2A. They have not had a winning record until last year when they were in 3A. This is their first year in 4A, and they finished 9-1, entering the playoffs with their only loss to 5-seeded league opponent Broomfield by 9. I've been beyond impressed with how Riverdale Ridge has played this season, and Voorhees has done an incredible job flipping this program from 2A what-ifs to 4A legits," end quote. Got to agree with Phoenix here. That's a great point that he made. And so that makes one vote for Landon McKee of Grand Junction and one vote for Wayne Voorhees here of Riverdale Ridge. Going to you, the fans, however, not as much love for Landon McKee, landing here at the number 4 spot with 14% of the votes. And Wayne Voorhees also not feeling the love here with 19% of the votes here. Zach Carlton finishing second, giving Jeremiah Berenson 40% of the vote here and being the fan-selected coach of the year here, and also tying this whole thing up at 1-1 here. Moving along to our next voter here, we're going to look at Gideon's vote here, who is actually going to be skipped over because I'm going to talk about Gino's vote first, and that's for theatrics. But Gino here voting for Landon McKee here, saying, quote, "I remember doing Grand Junction season preview and saying that they could win 5 to 6 games this season, and to be honest, I thought that was generous after the decade they've had so far. Coach McKee and the Tigers completely blew those expectations out the water by dominating the entire season, winning back the Battle of Grand Junction against Central, and easily winning their league on their way to a top 10 seed in the playoffs. That kind of improvement is something that can't go unrewarded. I know this was a senior-heavy class, plus they moved the I-25 league, but honestly, that league was super competitive this season with 4 different teams that could have realistically won it. Grand Junction shined above all of them, though, on their way to a league championship and a 9-1 regular season record," end quote. So, Gino makes Landon McKee take a slight lead here, leading 2-1. And I'm actually going to make this a little bit more interesting by sending my vote to Zach Carlton of Palmer Ridge here. Look, this was a team that I knew was returning some talent, but I thought with the question marks under center as well as who they might have at tailback, I just thought, and I mean, the way that they lost state last year was pretty disheartening here. To be able to recuperate this squad here, build off of the cornerstones from last year, create new cornerstones this year, was nothing short of impressive, honestly. And Zach Carlton, he has a ton of my respect here. He's somebody who runs a tight ship and somebody who has a lot of passion for the game of football and loves talking X's and O's and whatnot. And so Zach here is going to get my vote, and that makes it 2-1 with every single nominee receiving a vote so far. Spicing it up just a little bit more here is Coach V, who's going to be voting for Jeremiah Berenson here, who is now getting his second vote and is tied with Landon McKee. And on the vote, Coach V says, quote, "Filling the shoes of Coach Wout is not easy here, but getting the number 1 seed and dominating the opposing competition is a great start. They also lost some very quality seniors last season, so that makes this feat all the more impressive," end quote. So, with 2 votes here and 2 votes there and 1 vote here and 1 vote there, there's a lot on the line. Jeremiah technically has the tiebreaker right now, so it comes down to Gideon's vote, and who he votes for is going to be our coach of the year, and it's going to be Landon McKee here of Grand Junction. Gideon on his vote says, quote, "Grand Junction is not a school that a lot of people think about. The last time they made any noise in the playoffs was in 2005 when they lost in the 4A championship to Thunder Ridge. Landon McKee made this team relevant this year. I know it was the I-25 league, but they were top 15 in RPI before league play even started. the Tigers rallied and were a few points away from grabbing a first-round bye in the playoffs. I doubt that without McKee, the Tigers make it even close to that, end quote. So, Landon McKee is your 2024 4A Coach of the Year. Up next, we got our Newcomer of the Year that we vote on for the most outstanding freshman in a class here. And this was a pretty good freshman class here in 4A. A solid amount of contributors here and made for a very interesting nomination race for these fellows here. And the very first guy that we're going to talk about here is Mekhi Jones out of Thomas Jefferson High School. On the season, 338 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. One of those coming in the season opener against Niwot, where he had 53 yards. And then another pretty good game against, I want to say, Mountain Range High School in a 31-22 win. He actually notched a season-high 19 carries for 61 yards. He also had a decent game against Highlands Ranch High School, where he ran for another touchdown and 38 yards. And then Denver North was one of his better games of the year with 40 yards and a touchdown, and then in other league games broke 40 yards for the remainder of the season, with the exception of Montbello. So that was Mekhi Jones' season for the Spartans here, getting in and being a valuable rushing asset. Our next nominee here is Jacob Foote here, and he had a very good season at wide receiver here. He caught for 892 yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, and notched another 54 rushing yards on top of a kickoff return for a touchdown and 217 kickoff return yards. These notable games for the Foote here is in the season opener against Monarch, had 7 receptions for 80 yards, no scores, but he would follow that up with a receiving touchdown against Windsor, a receiving touchdown against crosstown rival Silver Creek, and then his best game of the season, at least statistically to this point, was against Palmer Ridge, where he caught 9 passes for 137 yards and a score here in a losing effort. In a winning effort, though, against Thomas Jefferson, he did notch 6 receptions for 132 yards and a receiving touchdown as well. He went on a little bit of a cold streak over the next 2 games, but bounced back with his truly best performance of the season against crosstown rival Skyline. 9 receptions, 233 yards, and a hat trick of touchdowns here to put a huge star and stamp on a phenomenal freshman season. Moving along here, our next finalist is Lucas Lawson out of Northfield here. He's a defensive end here who had a pretty solid season for this defense here that did not allow a ton of points per game here. And some of these examples here include the fact that he had 7.5 tackles for loss, including a 4 tackle for loss performance against Aurora Central High School, where he also had his highest total tackle count of the season at 8 and his highest sack performance of the season with 2.5. He also notched half sacks against the likes of G-Dub, Denver North, and Montbello, while also notching a full tackle for loss against Thomas Jefferson High School. In a very solid season here, 6'2", 200 pounds as a freshman is a great start, and Lawson should only get bigger and stronger as the years go on. Our final candidate here is of Cheyenne Mountain, and that's Mason Godshaw here, the defensive stalwart for this team. He recorded 75 total tackles here, 57 of those being solo tackles out on an island here, and he actually even recorded 10 tackles for loss, including notable performances against the likes of Pueblo Centennial, where he had 9 tackles and 2 for loss, Centaurus in a 26-23 win, where he had 7 total tackles and 2 of those for loss, 5 solo, 2 assisted, and then he had some other solid games, Sand Creek 5 tackles, Thornton 6 tackles, 1 for loss, and then his best game of the season was against a Grand Junction squad in league play. 16 total tackles, 11 which were solo, and 2 tackles for loss here. Just overall a pretty good season here. Also forced a couple of fumbles against the likes of Pueblo Centennial and Sand Creek, while also notching a pass deflection against Centaurus and Gateway, both in wins. That is Mason Godshaw's profile and tail of the tape for Newcomer of the Year for a 2024 edition here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the votes here, and we'll actually start off with y'all, the fans, who voted for Lucas Lawson at 46%. This was followed by Jacob Foote at 30%, Mason Godshaw at 17%, and Mekhi Jones at 7%. But Lucas Lawson of Northfield is the fan selected for a Newcomer of the Year in the 2024 season. However, not to be a spoiler, this is going to be a reverse sweep here, starting off with Coach V voting for Jacob Foote, saying, quote, while it was a down year for Longmont, he still carved out a role for himself as one of the top receivers on this squad. For him to be third in 4A in receiving yards already is insane, end quote. Gino also going with Jacob Foote, saying, quote, this one's a complete no-brainer. Respect to all the other candidates, Foote will be a receiving yards leader for the foreseeable future, especially if Longmont hires a head coach that likes to air it out, end quote. Gideon, keeping it rolling here, voting for Foote, saying, quote, simply put, Foote is a top 4 receiver in the state, I believe he's saying 4A, and balled out on a Longmont squad that squeaked into the playoffs. Whoever the next QB is at Longmont better thank his lucky stars that they get Jacob for the next 3 years, end quote. Phoenix, he's not going to switch it up. He's going with Foote, saying, quote, going to give my vote to the kid from Longmont because the stats don't lie. A solid receiver able to make plays on offense and has some special teams upside with that kickoff return touchdown, end quote. Coach Wout, not going to reinvent the wheel here, voting for Foote, saying, quote, he is just an outstanding wide receiver in the state and really the bright spot for a Longmont team who is down this year. He has a really great future ahead of him moving forward, end quote. And of course, myself, look, I'm a receivers guy, and so you may claim that I have some bias here, but I mean, almost going for 1,000 yards as a freshman receiver is pretty insane, and he had some great performances against some really good teams. Despite some losing efforts by the Trojans themselves, Foote was still able to, make an impact on this team and show that he's going to be the cornerstone for this offense for the foreseeable future. So, in a reverse sweep here, it is going to be, or a gentleman's sweep, I should say, Jacob Foote here is going to run away with the 4A 2024 Newcomer of the Year award. Up next, we got Defensive Playmaker of the Year here. Once again, just a reminder, these are regular season stats that we're looking at. And so with that being said, we got to open up with Elijah Brotherns of Sand Creek, the safety/defensive back here down south, who had himself a pretty phenomenal season in the Springs. The 6'1", 200-pound safety went for 30 tackles, but more impressively were his 4 for loss, 6 picks that included 51 interception return yards, and 10 pass deflections with 2 fumble recoveries. So, looking at Elijah's season here, he had himself some pretty solid games against the likes of Cheyenne Mountain in a huge league win, mind you. He had 5 total tackles, including 2 for loss here. He also had a fumble recovery in that game. If you look back to earlier in the season, he had 2 pass deflections against Denver East in a losing effort. He also had an interception against Harrison, as well as 5 total tackles here. In the Air Academy game, he had 2 picks for 14 interception return yards and 2 pass deflections to go with his 7 total tackles. Against Widefield, he had a fumble recovery in a 51-17 win on top of 5 total solo tackles. Against Palmer, he had a tackle for loss as well as 2 pass deflections. And then against the likes of Gateway, he actually had 2 picks and 2 pass deflections as well as half a sack and 0.5 of a TFL. And then Centaurus, he had 4 total tackles, half of 1 for loss, as well as an interception and a pass deflection. And in the final game of the season against Grand Junction, 6 total tackles here. Elijah Brotherns just in charge of the back half of that defense while also pulling a heavy load on offense. He impressed, forcing a ton of turnovers and just playing very well all over the field. Up next, we got a defensive lineman from the Springs once again, this time from Rampart High School, and that is Justice Derrickson here, the number 70 down low in the trenches, wreaking havoc on opposing offensive lines. He went absolutely berserk this season. 56 tackles, 26 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 9 hurries, 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, 2 pass deflections, and a partridge in a pear tree. Oh, sorry, I'm in the holiday mood. That's actually 1 field goal block to go with all of this. So defensive/special teams impacts here. Let's see kind of through the season how his game evolved, starting off with the 39-0 win over Falcon, where he had 4 tackles, including 1 for loss. Lewis Palmer, 8 tackles, 3 of those for loss, being one of his best performances to date. Against the likes of Falcon, that's where he recorded a sack and a pass deflection and forced fumble, by the way, so just an overall dominant performance. In a losing effort to Ponderosa, still put up 6 tackles in that game, but followed that up with arguably a fantastic game here. Discovery Canyon here, 6 tackles, 2 of those being for loss and a sack, but then his best game of the season, no question, came against Doherty here. 7 tackles for loss, 9 total tackles, 5 solo, 4 assisted, and 2.5 sacks on this day against a pretty solid Doherty offensive line here. Justice just would not be denied on his path of wreaking havoc. Against Durango here, he had 5 total tackles and 3 of those for loss, and matched a lot of that production against Vista Ridge with 3 tackles for loss, including 6 total tackles. Those were both losing efforts, but nonetheless still applied plenty of pressure in those games. And against Vista Ridge, that is where he notched his blocked field goal. In just a 7-point loss, every single point matters, and that still kept them in this game a little bit. Liberty, he had 2 TFLs, and then would bounce back in the remainder of the season against Air Academy in Grand Junction Central, where he had 4 tackles for loss apiece and 2.5 sacks over those 2 games. Justice Derrickson just very dominant over the course of this season. Keeping it here, and by here I mean moving north, we got Ilian Oliva here. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, out of Northfield High School. 96 tackles, 14 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, and a punt block as well. So another defensive / special teams impact guy. His most notable games of the season included the likes of Roosevelt, where he had 9 tackles, including 1.5 for loss. Mesa Ridge, he followed up with 8 and 1.5 for loss, and then went absolutely berserk against Heritage and Pueblo East with 14 and 19 tackles respectively, and 5 tackles for loss over those 2 games. That Pueblo East game, which was a 28-27 win, is where he did notch that block punt. So very critical to that win and eventually helping this team make the postseason. He would then have another pretty good game here a little bit later against Thomas Jefferson High School, 11 tackles and 2 of those being for loss, and would continue to basically notch over a tackle for loss per game over the course of the rest of the season, while notching plenty of sacks, 1.5 against Thomas Jefferson, 1.5 against Montbello, another 1 and 1.5 against Aurora Central and George Washington, respectively. So overall, Oliva did a fantastic job getting to the quarterback, coming off the edge, while also blowing up some runs in the backfield and getting a blocked punt in a very close win. That is Mr. Oliva's profile out of Northfield High School. And lastly, we end with our furthest most north candidate in this voting section here. That is Mason Smiley, the defensive back out of Broomfield High School, which best of luck to Broomfield in their state quest tomorrow. But defensively, this guy was a stud this year, notching 4 interceptions here against the likes of Monarch, Erie, Adams City, and Riverdale Ridge. Those were all pretty critical games as far as seeding goes outside of that Adams City one, obviously. But also had 28 tackles, 1 for loss, and 7 pass breakups here. 2 of those coming in that Grand Junction Central game. But was really on a roll here, getting a pass deflection in what looks like almost 6 games in a row here. But, was also getting involved in the tackle department. 6 solo tackles against Frederick to start the year. And then against the likes of Legacy, which was a 1-point win over another Broomfield squad, this one in 5A, he had 6 tackles, 4 that were solo, and 1 of those that was for loss. Even in their loss against Erie here, he still had 4 solo tackles, as well as that pick and a pass deflection against who has quietly become a pretty solid rivalry over the past few years. And then would also have a couple of good games just kind of down the stretch here. But Mason Smiley here, he is a glue guy in that secondary and was phenomenal this season for the Eagles. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to the voters here and see who's going to be our 2024 Defensive Playmaker of the Year. Starting with the fan vote this go around here, we're going to see that Elijah Brothers finished fourth, Justice Derrickson finished third, and Oliva finished second, with Mason Smiley garnering 45% of the vote, being the 2024 4A fan-selected Defensive Playmaker of the Year. Moving along to the rest of the panel, however, we're going to find some differences here, starting with Gideon here, who's voting for Justice Derrickson, saying, quote, Derrickson is a one-man wrecking crew. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many better DNs in the state, and his ability to move the marker backwards is almost paralleled. My only knock on him is I wish I could have seen him live. I can only imagine his stats in Wembanyama terms in the oh hell knows that RBs and QBs must have thought when they saw him standing there, end quote. Moving along here, Phoenix is going to stay consistent, saying, quote, Rampart has been a solid team this year, and a lot of credit goes to that defense with Derrickson leading the charge. Dude is frequently making plays in the backfield and is just involved everywhere on the field, forcing fumbles, blocking field goals, 26 tackles for loss is insane, and just a dominating presence altogether, end quote. Coach Wout, going to keep it the same. Justice Derrickson has been a dominant force on defense for Rampart. He is the absolute leader for that defensive squad and a reason that Rampart has had the great amount of success they have had this year, end quote. Simon, keeping it real and consistent in the spring, saying Justice Derrickson, he was unstoppable this year as a force in both stopping the run and applying pressure to the few teams who passed it. The stats back up his dominance, and for him to do it as a defensive lineman is special. 26 TFLs is also just insane, end quote. I'm also going to vote for Justice Derrickson. His game against Doherty is what really sold me. He flat out dominated, held the Spartans to 8 points in that game, and I think that he just makes all of his teammates better with the pass rush that he puts on. You'll notice that Rampart's secondary had quite a few interceptions this year, and that's with a guy like Derrickson in their face, or he's opened up plenty of opportunities for his backers to make a ton of tackles, drawing double teams and whatnot. Just his gravity on defense goes way beyond the box score, and the box score backs up his dominance as well. Gino here is voting for Justice here for a gentleman's sweep part 2, saying, quote, Rampart was one of the toughest defenses in 4A despite playing some very tough competition, and that is thanks to Derrickson's work in the trenches. The tackle numbers as a defensive lineman show that Derrickson is the heart and soul of the Rampart defense, and he is definitely deserving of DPOY with that kind of impact, end quote. So, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 6 possible votes, Justice Derrickson is your 4A 2024 Defensive Playmaker of the Year. And now we move on to the Offensive Playmaker of the Year award here. And let's go ahead and talk about the candidates here. And they're all solid dudes who helped lead their team to great seasons here. Starting off with Tanner Turch, the wide receiver out of Heritage High School on the regular season here. 907 receiving yards, but 11 receiving touchdowns, as well as 126 rush yards, which puts his total scrimmage yards over 1,002 rushing touchdowns, along with 109 kick return yards and 20 passing yards, being an engine here for this Heritage squad here. When we look at the list of games here, he rushed for his touchdown against the likes of Northfield and Bear Creek, but also had 72 yards in that Bear Creek game and 46 against Golden earlier in the season. But he is a receiver, and boy, did he put in some work. In the first 2 games of the season, he had 6 receptions for 199 yards and 3 touchdowns against Severance and Arapahoe combined. Then, after a little bit of a slump against Columbine, had a fantastic game, 9 receptions, 164 yards. Did not find the end zone, unlike the following 3-4 weeks in a row, like the Golden game, 9 receptions, 159 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. 5 receptions for 73 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns against Dakota Ridge. And then just an absolute masterclass against Bear Creek. 5 receptions, 135 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns, which would be the most he'd have until Air Academy just 2 weeks later, where he had 190 receiving yards on 5 receptions and 3 touchdowns again. He would catch for over 100 yards in 6 games during the regular season. He would catch for a touchdown in all but 3 games during the regular season, and he would catch for more than a single touchdown 5 times during the regular season. He was just super dominant this year and was essential to Heritage's success. Speaking of essential to success, let's go to the most important position on the field, where the 6'1", 170-pound quarterback lit up the scoreboard for Highlands Ranch here. 27 passing touchdowns to just 1 interception, along with 9 rushing touchdowns and 183 rushing yards. That belongs to Crew Gehrig here, or Gehrig. 2,246 passing yards, just an absolute masterclass of a season. Some notable games included, this guy did not even throw an interception until Dakota Ridge on October 17th. So for the first 7 games of the season, multiple passing touchdowns in every single game, no interceptions, breaking 200 yards against the likes of Chaparral, Thomas Jefferson, and Pondo, en route to that. He would also be completing around 60% of his passes during this stretch. And then even during the lull part of this season here, still threw 5 touchdowns to no picks and 384 yards against Heritage in a wild 54-67 shootout. If that doesn't sound more like a basketball score of the past, I'm not really sure what does. And then on top of that, some solid rushing performances. Thomas Jefferson, he had 4 carries for 50 yards and 2 scores, and then ran for a touchdown for the next 3 weeks following that. And in that Heritage game, also found pay dirt through the ground. So honestly, just somebody who could light up the scoreboard and was dang near perfect, really, this season as far as not turning the football over and helping lead this Highlands Ranch team to a very solid season. And that's Crew Gehrig here. Will Applegate is another quarterback here who led his team to a very solid season. Much differently, however, at 6'4", 240 pounds. This was a huge-time dual threat, passing for 805 yards and 15 touchdowns and just 2 picks, while rushing for 435 yards and 14 rushing touchdowns. That's 29 total touchdowns on the season through the air and ground in the regular season. He had some notable performances, such as the Fruited Monument game, where he went 10 of 15 for 131 yards and passed for 3 touchdowns, as well as rushing for another 38 yards in that game and helping lead them to a victory. In the Gateway game, he passed for 154 yards and 2 touchdowns to no picks. Same story with Thornton there, 2 touchdowns to no picks as far as some of his more prolific passing performances go. Gateway was a season high in that regular season. And then as far as rushing goes, just kind of kept it consistent. Ran for a touchdown against everybody except for Fruta here, going for 1, 2, 1, 0, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2 to close the season here. And ultimately was the quarterback of this team that had their best season, actually matching their win total, including the postseason, of the past 5 years combined. That is Will Applegate out of Grand Junction High School. And finally, we got Aviera Elvira here, 1,285 rushing yards and 15 rushing touchdowns. Palmer Ridge is a team that likes to run the ball, and boy, once they started handing it to him, they did not lose for the remainder of the season here. You can kind of see near the beginning of the season a little bit of a slow start, 7 carries for 42 yards and a score against Ponderosa, but as the season went on, 6 carry, 106-yard performance against Longmont. And then following the loss to Mesa Ridge, that is when they converted fully to the Elvira offense. 14 carries, 169 yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. Durango, 21 carries, 219 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Vista Ridge, 23 carries, 290 yards, a season high, and 2 rushing touchdowns. And then he would match his hat trick total against Rampart, a very good rushing defense, mind you. 16 carries, 200 yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns. He was essential to this team's success, and it shows in the box score as well as the win-loss column. So, looking to our offensive playmaker of the year votes here, I am going to be voting for Tanner Turch here. This guy was just critical to this Heritage offense. Also probably got a little bit of receiver bias for me here, but I really think in a year where, they had to replace a starting quarterback, when you have a security blanket like Tanner, who just runs routes very well. I actually just did his evaluation for our top 5 series, so be on the lookout for that here in just a few weeks. But Tanner very much impressed me on the film. He's just got fantastic hands and just finds a way to get open, or even if he's not open, he kind of is open. So that is Tanner Turch's vote for me. Switching it up is going to be Phoenix here, who's voting for Crew Gehrig here, saying anyone with stats he put up this season should be deservingly recognized, north of 2,200 yards passing, but what's even more impressive, a 27-1 TD to INT ratio, That's just incredible. And to cap it off, 9 rushing touchdowns, quite literally an offensive playmaker by definition. End quote. Coach Wout going to follow suit here. Crew Gehrig saying, quote, Crew Gehrig made Highlands Ranch relevant again with his play. He was the leader of that program and helped them advance to the playoffs for the first time in a long time. His 28-3 TD to INT ratio is outstanding. Highlands Ranch is not the team they were without him, end quote. But now we get to you, the fans here. Now, Crew Gehrig does get third place in this fan vote, and Aviero Elvira gets 29%. And with Will Applegate sitting at 11, that means that Tanner Turch won the fan vote here. 40% of you, the people, voted for Tanner Turch to be the 4A Offensive Playmaker of the Year, according to the fans. And you actually agree with me here, but that ties it up at 2-2. Let's see if that is enough to give him the edge here in this candidacy. Coach V's vote is going to swing the pendulum back towards Gehrig here as he votes for him, saying, quote, while it hasn't always translated to wins, I love the efficiency and production he has had throughout the season. This Highlands Ranch team making the playoffs in 4A is because of how efficient he has been. Gehrig has been able to throw them into some close matchups, and I respect that so much, end quote. So that makes it 3-2, Crew Gehrig, with Gino's vote on the way. Gino here is going to say, quote, Highlands Ranch's move down to 4A this year proved to be everything they needed to be a solid team. Crew Gehrig's ridiculous surge in touchdowns and efficiency this season helped lead HR to their first playoff appearance in years. The Falcons were able to lean on him for 4 quarters in every single game, with Gehrig having 5 different games with 40-plus pass attempts on the season in multiple shootouts. What a fantastic senior season for Gehrig. He is definitely deserving of this award, end quote. And with Gehrig's 4-2 lead, that is going to secure his win. But Gideon here with the cherry on top is also voting for him, saying, quote, seeing him in person, Gehrig is the Highlands Ranch offense. Yes, they have some weapons, but Gehrig is the spark that sets them ablaze. They also did much better than expected in arguably the toughest league in 4A this year. Even if they didn't win much of that league, Gehrig's efficiency is most impressive to me. With only 1 interception in the regular season, a special player, that's what he is. Even if he doesn't play in college, Gehrig will be remembered for a long time, end quote. So, your 2024 4A Offensive Playmaker of the Year goes to Highland Ranch's Crew Gehrig. Now, coming up, we are going to discuss the All-Playmaker teams as well as the most valuable playmaker. But first, an ad break, and we'll be right back. Obviously, you want a trainer who can make you stronger and faster with the work you put in. But what about a trainer who can help you rehab and recover like the pros? Look no further than Junkyard Training, that not only offers specific strength and speed training, but also offers a plethora of recovery and rehab techniques like cryo, cupping, recovery boots, and so much more. Learn more today by visiting junkyardtraining.net or call 303-521-7594. Once again, visit junkyardtraining.net or call 303-521-7594 and get started today. All right, and following that, we are ready for our most valuable playmaker segment. After the All-PMC teams, this race at quarterback was brutal. But as a reminder, our All-PMC teams are built by us here at Playmakers Corner. All of us get into a meeting, talk about impact, and have a discussion, and eventually land on these teams here. So, on these teams, just as a reminder, we get 2 quarterback spots, 2 running back spots, 3 wide receiver spots, an athlete spot, a tight end spot, 2 offensive tackles, 3 interior offensive linemen, 2 defensive tackles, 2 edge players, 2 linebackers, 3 corners, 2 safeties, 2 kickers, and a punter. And with all of that considered, we go ahead and put this list together. I'm going to go backwards here, starting with the punter, Aiden Sand from Liberty. Our 2 kickers are Rhett Armstrong from Palmer Ridge and Nate Hart of Monarch. Our 2 safeties are Elijah Brotherns out of Sand Creek and Christopher Hinojosa out of Mesa Ridge. Our cornerbacks are Mason Smiley out of Broomfield, Max Raiton out of Rampart, and Kobe Stewart out of Dakota Ridge. Our linebackers are Camden Bruns out of Rampart and Levi Thiessen out of Mesa Ridge. Our 2 edge players are Cody Moore out of Loveland and Justice Derrickson out of Rampart. And our 2 defensive tackles to wrap up the defensive side of the ball are Marcus Weston out of Dakota Ridge and Samuel Vasquez Lopez out of Riverdale Ridge. Moving to the offensive side of the ball, we're going to start in the trenches with our interior offensive linemen being Jackson Downs out of Air Academy, Court Towns out of Palmer Ridge, and Ty LaCrue out of Broomfield. Our offensive tackles are both going to be out of Broomfield with Isaiah Garcia Perez and Evan Haynes. Our tight end is going to be Burke Eisman out of Frederick. Our wide receivers are going to be Tanner Turch out of Heritage, Shane Curry out of Thomas Jefferson, and Sonny Rogers out of Mesa Ridge. Our running backs are going to be Aviera Elvira out of Palmer Ridge and Landon Kalsbeck out of Dakota Ridge. Our athlete is going to be Will Applegate out of Grand Junction. And our quarterbacks are going to be Gavin Ishmael out of Frederick and Bryce Reel out of Mesa Ridge. Now, with all of that being discussed, we can move on to the most valuable playmaker race here. If you've been wondering where some names are, they probably fell into here. And one of those being Gavin Ishmael, who just made the All-PMC team at quarterback here, who is a finalist here for most valuable playmaker over the course of the regular season, passing for 2,369 yards, throwing 29 touchdowns to just 4 picks, but also notching on 496 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns. When we look at some of his notable games here, at least through the air, we have a 338-yard, 5-touchdown to 0-pick performance against Montbello. We have a 297-yard performance with 6 touchdowns to no picks on 10 of 11 passing. We also have a pretty solid night against Loveland, 16 of 25 for 274 yards and 2 passing touchdowns to no picks. We also have a big game against Pooter, 17 of 24, 326 yards and 6 touchdowns to no picks, as well as a 280-yard, 2-touchdown to 1-pick performance against Monarch and a 230-yard, 4-touchdown to 0-pick win over Greeley West. Looking at some of his best rushing performances, he gets a hat trick of touchdowns against Skyline on just 8 carries for 73 yards. His best rushing performance of the season came against Loveland, 14 carries for 141 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. He would then follow that up with 2 consecutive games with a rushing touchdown, and then against Monarch, he would have his other triple-digit game of the season with 10 carries for 100 yards in that game. So overall, Gavin Ishmael was the focal point of this Frederick offense. I remember one of his first games that I ever saw was against George Washington for a league title, and while he did not capture that back in the day, he has been absolutely nothing short of phenomenal here for this Frederick team and helped this team go round and was just everything you could possibly ask for out of a quarterback and a leader for this squad. Moving on to our next nominee, it is another quarterback here. This is a quarterback-dominated MVP race here, and it's no different with Bryce Reel out of Mesa Ridge down in Colorado Springs, who had himself a season. 2,261 passing yards, 27 touchdowns to just 4 picks, along with 546 rushing yards and 9 rushing touchdowns, as well as a conversion here. So yes, that puts him in some pretty elite company here, going for over 2,800 yards and 36 total touchdowns on the season. He did a ton of his damage against the likes of Air Academy, 2 touchdowns to no picks, while also rushing for 2 touchdowns in that game for a 4 TD performance. Against Northfield in a 50-47 shootout, he went 9 of 13 for 310 yards and 4 passing touchdowns, while also rushing for 78 yards and a touchdown in that game. In a close loss to Dakota Ridge here, he still broke 60 yards rushing. Against Heritage in a playoff potential matchup, 13 of 21, 191 yards and 3 touchdowns to no picks, while also rushing for 100 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Against Palmer Ridge in a close win, winning 31-28 here, 28 of 34, 319 yards with 4 passing touchdowns to no picks, along with 133 yards and a rushing touchdown. I am pretty sure he won Playmaker of the Week that week. Now, he'd have a couple of solid performances, but would not get the win, but would bounce back a few weeks later against Doherty, 25 of 40, 354 yards and 4 touchdowns to no picks. This would be the first of 2 straight regular season games of doing such a thing here, including Falcon with a perfect 7 of 7 for 286 yards and 4 passing touchdowns. In those games, not really having to do it on the ground, just carving them up through the air. This offense was electric to watch. It is a dually offense. You have to be a high-level quarterback to produce in it and to get the reads, and that's exactly what Bryce Reel was, does, and is capable of, en route to an MVP caliber season. Another quarterback here that we're going to be talking about, but also just a fierce athlete, is Gavin Lockett out of Pueblo West here. I'm pretty sure that he claims the throne on most Playmaker of the Week awards, and a huge part of that is his rushing prowess. Now, passing the ball, he was still productive. 946 passing yards, 12 touchdowns to his 3 picks, but another 882 rushing yards and 15 rushing touchdowns would severely inflate those stats for you, as well as 17 tackles, getting in on some defensive stops here. When we look at his more notable passing games, you got to look at Lutheran that they won, where he went 10 of 11 for 169 yards and 2 passing touchdowns to no picks. The same stat line that he would basically repeat against Vista Ridge, this time with 127 yards and still no picks in that game. In a loss later in the season to Montrose, 10 of 16, 197 yards and 2 touchdowns to just a single interception, which was not the way that he wanted to end the season, but still a pretty efficient night. Rushing the football, however, was his bread and butter, opening up with 88 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns against Loveland. Then a couple weeks later against Pomona and Lutheran, broke the 100-yard barrier, going for 159 and 118 respectively, with 2 and 3 rushing touchdowns in those games. He would then follow that up with another solid 79-yard performance and then 86 yards and 2 touchdowns against Doherty. But against Mesa Ridge, this was his signature game here in a 3-point win. 25 carries for 206 yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, just putting on an absolute clinic against the Grizzlies defense. And yeah, those legs have made him very, very special over the past few years, and it has been such an honor to cover Gavin Lockett and everything that he has done for this Pueblo West Cyclone team. And finally, our final MVP candidate is none other than Landon Kalsbeck here, the junior running back / linebacker from Dakota Ridge High School. Easily the guy that makes this team turn. 45 passing yards or passing touchdown, 1,121 rushing yards and 17 rushing touchdowns, along with 168 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown, was only his offensive impact. So you heard it here first. He passed, ran, and caught touchdowns this year for this team. I don't really know what more you could ask of a player, but that is exactly what the doctor ordered. He did a lot of this damage in games such as Green Mountain, where he had 3 rushing touchdowns and 118 rushing yards. In a close win over Mesa Ridge, he was pivotal. 23 carries, which was a season high, as well as 183 rush yards, which was a season high, and 2 rushing touchdowns in that game. Against Pomona here, 11 carries, 119 yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns. A couple weeks later, he would break the 100-yard mark against Ponderosa with 135 yards and 2 scores. Against Heritage, while he did have 14 carries for 91 yards, he would not find pay dirt except through the air. His 1-of-1 45-yard, 1-touchdown performance was in that game on some trickery. A few weeks later, he would go nuts against the likes of Golden and Bear Creek, going for 119 yards in both games and combining for 4 touchdowns across those 2 games to close out the regular season. This does not even mention his defensive impact, however, as he did notch 63 tackles on the regular season, 9.5 for loss, and 6.5 sacks, along with 17 hurries, 3 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, and a pass deflection in a pear tree, not to mention a few punt yards. But really, this defensive impact, you got to look at this Mesa Ridge game here. It was his best rushing performance, and it was his best defensive performance as well. 4 sacks and 2 hurries in that game, while also forcing a fumble and notching a total of 5 tackles on that night. Or 10 tackles, my apologies. 5 of those being for loss and 9 of those being solo. So Mesa Ridge, just an essential game to his defensive campaign. He would follow that up with 9 and 8 tackle performances against Pomona and Cherokee Trail, with a TFL in both of those as well, and would reignite a 9 tackle performance, 1 tackle for loss game against Heritage. He would also get a fumble recovery and force a fumble in that game as well. So again, some of the best competition is when Landon Kalsbeck would turn it up and play his best football of the year. But now that we have the whole year in review here, let's go ahead and talk about our MVP votes. Starting off with Coach Landon Kalsbeck is Coach V's selection for 4A 2024 MVP, saying, quote, "We knew that he would take a step forward this season, and so in a lot of ways, this isn't really surprising at all that this elite 2A player is here. He has a big hand in every single one of those games, whether it's on offense or defense. There aren't many players in all of Colorado that are getting the usage Kalsbeck is while succeeding," end quote. And for me, I'm actually going to follow suit here and also vote for Landon Kalsbeck. These quarterbacks have done a fantastic job of leading their teams to great seasons, but Kalsbeck two-way performance led to the number 1 seed for Dakota Ridge this year, and obviously he was the most critical player in those close win games, and that is why he is getting my vote for the 4A 2024 Most Valuable Playmaker. Gino here, not going to reinvent the wheel, saying, quote, "The best player on offense and defense for the top team in 4A this year. Kalsbeck is a D1 linebacker and a very capable running back who just had a hell of a season for Dakota Ridge. When it comes to most valuable playmaker, Kalsbeck is the very definition as he provides incredible impact on both sides of the ball for an elite team," end quote. Gideon here, keeping it rolling, saying, quote, "Playing both ways in 4A is a relative rarity, and to excel is even more so. To do even better during the biggest performances, insane. The game that stamped this award in my mind is the contest against Mesa Ridge. 4 sacks for a player to have that type of game in that situation and get that result, MVP," end quote. And Gideon here usually puts a second place vote, but he did not do it this time because that is how much Landon Kalsbeck won it in his mind. Phoenix here. I mean, if you listen to Phoenix's 1A recaps, you should probably know where this is going. And he says, quote, "Hard to deny the success Dakota Ridge has had this year, and a lot of credit goes to Kalsbeck for being a total playmaker on both sides of the ball. Rushing for over 1,000 and scoring 17 touchdowns, while also getting it done on defense, having 6.5 sacks and 9.5 TFLs. His effort out on the gridiron is a big reason as to why Dakota Ridge is where they are. Without him, we wouldn't even be talking about Dakota Ridge right now," end quote. And Phoenix, like I said, listen to his 1A recaps. He played 1A/2A ball, and he played both ways as well. So, somebody who has a high level of impact is really going to just blow the doors off for Phoenix here. Coach Wout here, you could call this maybe bias, but also everybody else voted for him, so he's just falling in line here, voting for Kalsbeck as well as the best player in the state for the class of 26. Dominant player on both sides of the ball. 1 point led the state in TDs and sacks. His performance against a very good Mesa Ridge team was unbelievable. His last game of the season, he had 4 carries for 119 yards, averaging 29.1 per carry. He's a playmaker on both sides of the ball for the Eagles," end quote. And you know what? To further prove that there's no bias here, you, the fans, agree with us here. As Bryce Reel got 16, Ishmael with 18, and Lockett with 25% of the vote, 41% of fans voted for Landon Kalsbeck to be the most valuable playmaker of the 4A classification in the 2024 season. And that is a unanimous 4A MVP for Landon Kalsbeck here. Congratulations to all of the nominees of all the other awards here. But Landon Kalsbeck is your 4A 2024 MVP. And with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and go back over everyone who won here, with the Coach of the Year award going to Landon McKee of Grand Junction. We had Newcomer of the Year go to Jacob Foote of Longmont. Defensive Playmaker of the Year was nearly a unanimous selection of Justice Derrickson out of Rampart. Offensive Playmaker of the Year was Crew Gehrig out of Highlands Ranch High School. And the 4A 2024 MVP went unanimously to Dakota Ridge running back / linebacker / defensive edge rusher here, pressurer, whatever you need him to be, Landon Kalsbeck. That's going to do it for this episode of the Playmakers Corner podcast. We still have a poll going on for 5A. If you were listening to this on Friday, go ahead, get over to Twitter /X, vote for the 5A awards. That episode will be out next week, as well as our 5A recap of what happened, as well as the 4A and 3A championships potentially. So go ahead and tune in to the last recap of the season, and then we have tons of content coming up for you. Primarily our top 5 series here that we've continued to do. It was the very first series we ever did on the podcast, and we are continuing it this year for every single position where we grade. We have new rubrics this year that have weighted categories, so this is our best set of evaluations yet. Please tune into those no matter where you're listening or watching: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts. We're on all of those. Make sure you have notifications turned on, or be sure to follow us on social media, whether that's at Playmakers Corner on Instagram, Playmakers Corner on Facebook, Playmaker Corner on Twitter/X, and Playmakers Corner on TikTok, where we got highlights and stuff like that for you. Honestly, it has been such a blast covering this season of football, and we look forward to the end of it and looking ahead towards flag football in the spring on the college level. So stay tuned for plenty of more action. I have been your host for this episode, Cody Stauffer, signing off. Peace.